So Dr. Ingo Lambrecht is a consultant clinical psychologist working in Auckland, New Zealand. His special interests include children and adolescents, psychosis and personality issues, as well as trauma and mindfulness. He's also written on the cultural clinical interface through clinical and psychoanalytic work in different cultural settings, and was privileged to undergo an intense shamanic training as a Sangoma, a South African traditional healer. And he has a book on that, Sangoma Trance States, and has also written articles and chapters on related subjects. So maybe without further ado, I will turn it over to Ingo. And let me.
Thank you, Ron, for your kind introduction and for setting this up. It is much appreciated. This would not be possible a few years ago, and now we can talk to each other from distant countries. So today I thought I would focus on shamanic spiritual emergencies and wonder with you a bit about some issues that I have found to be curious and found to be interesting. I want to just make very clear that this is one approach. There are many approaches to spiritual emergencies, and this is definitely not the answer, but a place to wonder about it and then to see where this might take us. So I have kind of a few approaches in this talk that might lead us to think about it, or think about psychosis even maybe a bit differently. I will be approaching the spiritual emergency a bit differently, but you'll see what I'll be doing. So now I'm going to just take this next slide. Now, what you're seeing is a skull. And you see, if you look, you see two holes. And why I bring this image up is the art of trepanation, i.e., creating neurosurgery 10,000 years ago, suggests that actually our ancient civilizations, our so-called shamanic ancestors, weren't always as unsophisticated as it is often portrayed, or has been portrayed. I want you to look more closely at those holes in the skull. You will notice that they actually have healed. So somebody has operated on somebody twice, and twice this person has survived. I just wanted to bring that up as a little reminder that the professionalism and the capacity of the ancient ones might surprise us, and still do. It is often claimed that this was done to release demons from people's skull in terms of headaches. I think that is just a typical interpretation of some who cannot hold the imagination that others might have actually some knowledge that is accessed differently. So let us begin. The shaman, as you may know, is a traditional healer, is a term I'm going to use to cover all traditions that access trance states. Because if you wish, the shaman is one of the first psychologists or psychiatrists. They define distress in regards to possession of spirits, to lack of ancestral protection, bewitchment, imbalance of energy. So I am not saying that all shamans are exactly the same. I would just want to hold that shamanic traditions access altered states of consciousness, and with that, within their own specific tradition, have a certain model with which they understand distress. But these are some rough guidances of what is often understood as distress. Now here's an image of my teacher, Daniel Baloy, who is at his Ndumba, and giving thanks to the ancestors. You will see on the right-hand side a cup of sorghum beer for the ancestors, some incense sticks in the background, and further back some cloth holding containers of beads and ostrich feathers. So what I wanted to talk to you about is one of my experiences that I had when I trained as a Sangoma. And in this ordinary life of a Sangoma, what my teacher would often say is that he would welcome people who are very distressed, who we would consider to be floridly psychotic. I remember one person, the parents had actually tied him with wires in the backyard because he was so uncontainable. And they brought him this young man, and what Daniel did, he would take people like this who were struggling and in deep distress into his home. And there he would treat this person regularly in an everyday life setting. And I would see how they would, help in the kitchen, sit with a Sangoma when he have other clients, help him kind of cut down the herbs. So a person who's distressed would actually live with a Sangoma. He says he could basically cure psychosis in 3-4 months. So they are taken into everyday life. They are given certain treatment. One of them is Danisa, which is to drink herbal waters that have been enriched with herbs. I used to have to do this as well, 4 or 5 liters and then vomit it out again. That creates a very strange state in you, a very relaxed state, but it is quite a procedure. You would also, my apologies, the palaza is that. The Danisa is like, if you wish, a bit like acupuncture, where you create little cuts at certain points where you would rub in herbs, and in that way, like over here, you can do it over here, and these points would be rubbed with certain herbs to have a healing effect. Now, one thing that's quite striking in my experience with shamans is actually that medication is actually quite important. Whereas I understand that ISPS focuses on the psychological approaches, within a shamanic tradition, or at least the one I was trained in, medication is actually a central one. And it's not common that the spirituality and medication can be mixed very strongly. So the treatment always includes medication. In fact, not to include medication would often be quite upsetting for certain clients. They expect that. It doesn't mean not other things happen as well, but medication is considered to be a central part of the healing. And I found that when I was with my teacher, he would allow some clients to be able to really regress, if you wish, to use an old-fashioned psychoanalytic term, to become very young. I would see him roll up in my teacher's lap and just become the child, and he would very soothingly and kindly allow this person to be where he is in a safe environment. It was very touching to watch. So in my understanding of what I saw was that people with severe distress actually weren't separated out, weren't placed in white rooms, were actually part of the family, were engaged, and were part of the household. And so it began. Now this has, of course, if you want to follow up a modern version of this in Sweden, just go onto the YouTube and look at Healing Homes, where a similar idea is set up, where people are brought into the home, into an ordinary life, which in fact is exceptionally healing, together with therapy. Right. So here are some of the spiritual emergencies I've worked with. and so I'm not claiming I've worked with every spiritual emergency that exists, but these are the ones I have come across in my work. And we'll talk a bit about the Kundalini awakening, the Qigong psychosis, the Ukutwasa we'll talk a bit about, and we'll talk a bit about Mate Maori, which means kind of the illnesses for Maori, like Mate Kite and Makutu. We'll talk a bit about them, my work with them. So what I'd like to focus on now is beginning to ask whether maybe psychosis could be understood as an altered state of consciousness. Because, in fact, psychosis doesn't exist as a thing. It's episodic, it comes, it goes, it's an experience. It's an experience of our awareness, and our awareness is able to capture what is going on in us in psychosis. So what this could mean is that we could consider what is today called extreme states, maybe in a specific way. And so I am approaching this from, if you wish, the trance states. So and it's quite surprising that in many ways mental health still considers mental health as a thing, as a collection of symptoms. Whereas maybe it's worth considering consciousness as something that is worth investigating. It's a robust phenomena, it's related to brain activity, and it's important in terms of our behavior. That's not a surprise. But here's what's interesting. Research has shown that trance states or altered states of consciousness have not only long-lasting effects on cognition and emotion, but also have effect on the brain. And this research by Lutz is specific to meditation and how it enhances gray matter. So meditation or any state of consciousness actually affects the brain, changes the brain. Nowadays, that's not so surprising, but even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this was seen as pretty outrageous. For many, this is still difficult to accept. Now, what is true, though, is that we do not really have an overarching model of altered states or trance states. We have maybe traditions that have specific models or ways of looking at it, but actually most really we haven't really got our head around that yet. And that is still something to be researched and found. Now, and not surprising for many who know this, dissociation is often equated with trance states and altered states of consciousness, or to use a psychoanalytic term, splitting. So dissociation need not only be pathological, we do this all the time. Right now, I'm focusing in on the scream. I'm ignoring the runners going down the road in the morning. So dissociation need not only be pathological, but it's also a technique specifically used to heal and enter other worlds. So induction techniques are used to establish dissociation. We can do this through severe pain. We can do this through fasting. We can do this through certain plants like ayahuasca. We can do this through meditation. Always, or we can do this through concentration, always to establish a healthy form of dissociation, or if you wish, a voluntary one. So many cultures have accepted trance states as a form of dissociation in the service of the self and, of course, of the community in the shamanic tradition. So how do you induce it? Well, actually, first you destabilize your normal state of consciousness, repattern this another state of consciousness, and stabilize that. So when you sit down for meditation, you might close your eyes and thereby shift your ordinary state of consciousness that you might be in to focusing on a new one, and then try to keep that state of consciousness by bringing yourself back and back again if, let's say, you're concentrating on an object. This is just an example of how to induce that. Now, what's important is that many societies worldwide have so-called auditory and visual hallucinations. They are not considered to be hallucinations, but strictly speaking, in the psychiatric term, they would be. Yet they serve the self and the community. Such strong trance states are voluntary, experienced in a positive manner as part of healing practices or religious practices. And they're often associated with long training and high degree of expertise, as we shall come to. So, now, the shamanic initiation crisis is often confused with psychosis due to the presence of kind of bizarre behavior. And in the, amongst the anthropologists of, about 100 years ago or more, this was seen as a sign of mental illness. And this is the notion of the shamanic crisis. Excuse me. The spiritual crisis. Now, amongst shamanic traditions, however, these symptoms are specific, and in some, there's a clear differential diagnosis between shamanic illness and psychosis. Not in all, but in some. I cannot speak for all. So, the shamanic crisis, if you wish, could be understood as a developmental crisis in Western discourse. So you have these notions in Western discourse currently of spiritual emergencies, as a la Groff, mystical states with psychotic features, a la Lukov, or the hero's journey with Campbell. So, and of course, there are new models now out that are constantly evolving, but these are kind of three very traditional ways of thinking about spiritual emergencies that have an ancient root, and these things are well known in traditional societies. Now, let's wonder a bit about this. Van der Kolk has already, with his work on trauma, really shown that spontaneous trances can occur during severe stress or trauma. We know that dissociation has been closely associated with symptoms of functional psychosis. And we could understand, if we're going to think about it that way, as a result of post-traumatic dissociative psychosis. So what we're talking about is that dissociation is part of psychosis. Here's a very important point to this. There's really no way of really deciding which hallucination or so-called hallucination is due to a dissociation or due to a psychosis. You see, how do you differentiate that? And if we can't differentiate it, maybe the common function of dissociation creates auditory and visual experiences within us. And for some, it might lead down a track of PTSD. For some, it might lead down a track of psychosis, if we want to think in a Western diagnostic way. But it challenges the notion that you can separate this out. So voluntary dissociative and trance phenomena, many cultures produce so many so-called hallucinations within a specific cultural context. So if that is the case, maybe dissociation or trance states are closely related to psychotic states. So one hypothesis that I might want to put out here is that the psychological process of voluntary culturally determined trance states may be similar to the involuntary dissociative or psychotic trance states. The similar process in consciousness may be occurring. And if it is, it would be the link between the shamanic spiritual crisis and people with psychosis. Things look similar, maybe different, maybe the same. We could argue that. But it is an attempt to try to link psychosis with trance states, which is based on a different understanding of consciousness, namely consciousness that is able to produce phenomena through dissociation. Now, psychopathology then could be deemed to be a disturbed state of consciousness, which is uncontrolled or be involuntary trances. Therefore, it could be argued that psychosis is an altered state of consciousness with a negative outcome, namely the inability to master it. And we'll see why that matters. Similarly, depression is considered pathological, while sorrowing is a normal process. So could psychosis be seen as a difficult, distressful process that has some negative consequences, whereas entering a trance state which has seemingly bizarre imagery is a painful process, the crisis, but might resolve more positively. So dissociative disorders, so-called, like dissociative identity disorder, could be reinterpreted as an involuntary secular possessive trance state. And if you wish, some are culture-bound, such as amok, or so in a way we could wonder whether actually most of our states described in DSM, if they be rewritten, could be rewritten from an angle of consciousness rather than just a collection of symptoms, and we might be able to move away from a very categorical process of mental health. Now, of course, psychosis is understood differently in other cultures. And I don't want to labor the point so much, but just minor things like, of course, social and spiritual meaning is more attached to psychosis rather than it's your fault, it's your brain. Medical values, it's just your body, or it's your psychoanalytic processes that have gone awry. As I said, in non-Western cultures, it's neither the individual's or the family's fault. And basically, it is sometimes understood as due to malevolent spirits. It could be the curse of sorcerers and witches. It could be broken taboos, and I've worked with somebody with that, for example, or the absence of protective ancestors. So in that way, it is a totally different understanding. And for people in other cultures, psychosis is understood as consciousness being shifted and creating immense pain due to other beings that are in the world, because a human being is not understood merely in materialistic ways. Okay, so let's look at an example of this from my experience. So voices as spirit possession. We could give you an example what I came across in my experience in South Africa. There's a distress called Amafufunyana, and then there's Okutwaza. These are two different, amongst the Shamans, Sangomas, there's considered two different illnesses or forms of distress. According to Western psychiatry, they would look both the same. Definitely a sign of psychosis or schizophrenia. So both would look quite unwell. You would have the typical auditory hallucination, the severe distress, the agitation, the possible paranoia, the sense of flaying of arms, the distress in the person about beings they might be seeing or hearing, voices, very intense voices. And for them, this is worth differentiating, whereas in Western psychiatry, this would not be possible. And it would not be possible because Western psychiatry does not have a model of voices may have different causes in terms of beings. And that's why Western psychiatry wouldn't know what to do with this. So Amafufunyana is considered a negative possession, or a possession of a negative being that is interfering in somebody's life and requires support. And what has happened that somehow this person might have avoided the proper process and rituals of ancestors, so their own protective ancestors are no longer with them, have removed themselves, and a person needs to become aligned again in terms of spiritual practices, in terms of healing rituals which they need to undergo. And people who were in this distress would come to my teacher and live with him, and he would slowly integrate them back into life. And they would, if you'd see them, they would be severely stressed. I think they would end up in an inpatient unit, in my understanding of my experiences. Now, the ukutwaza is different. The ukutwaza is an initiation illness requiring shamanic training. Yes, you also live with your teacher, but much longer, 2 to 3 years often, for your training. It's going to cost you far more. In fact, many don't want this because they know what it means. It means a total different life. How do you read the difference? Well, I was taught that, as with every illness, you access the knowledge through divination. So when you go to a Sangoma, you don't actually tell the Sangoma what you have, why you're there. You just sit there. Usually they actually sit already in what is called the surgery room. They sit on the floor and wait for you. You have no idea why they're there. And it is your job, through divination, i.e. the scattering of bones that you can see there as an image, and that's my teacher's foot over there in the left-hand corner, top corner. The scattering of divination bones and objects are actually your work to determine what is going on. Now, this is actually a form of checking whether you're good enough or not. If you don't read this correctly, they have every right to take the money and go elsewhere. And this is a test of how good the Sangoma is. If the Sangoma does not know that you have a right knee problem, or does not know that you are feeling nauseous, or does not know that you have just been promoted and you're a bit worried about your boss, then it's clearly not the Sangoma to go to. So, in the act of divination, you then determine whether this is a kutwaza or a mafunyana. So in that way, the kutwaza is determined. It's also determined by a few other things, especially dreams, what kind of voices are. And here's the difference between a mafunyana and an ukutwaza. At the ukutwaza, it's not negative spirits that drive you. It's your own ancestors. They push you into a life of healing. They just drag you through painful experiences, haunting you with pushing you into a life of healing. And this is resisted. This is well known, the resistance. Every shaman knows this. People don't want to do this. And so the ancestors start bringing in the pressure. And in that way, your life falls apart, or your internal processes start getting stretched beyond tolerance. And this distress leads you often to a shaman to become healed. And often then you need to find the right teacher. So going to a Sangoma might just be the start. It might be the teacher you've always looked for, but you usually get signals where this is the case. So for many, this is a process, a lifetime process. And I've heard many who said they never wanted to do this because it is such a profound change in your life. You then stay with your teacher. You would be diagnosed by a Western psychiatric person as probably having bipolar, definitely psychotic. And in that way, how you distinguish this from a mafunyana can only be done with a Sangoma. Lukov has a model that tries to understand this, and I think it's relatively helpful actually to wonder a bit about that states of consciousness, or our awareness or our trance states cannot be separated out neatly and cleanly, but contrary, they actually are overlapping, and there are experiences that are overlapping. So if you would look at this, you could see that actually not all of psychotic states are mystical states, and not all mystical states are psychotic states, but there is an overlap where we share certain behaviors, imagery, auditory experiences that are difficult to tease out. Or people might be experiencing both. Or do they experience something that is different from both? Both not mystical nor psychotic, but something different. I don't think we know enough. Our science of consciousness is so poor that we just have no idea. I think we are all trying to guess and come up with clever ideas, but generally we haven't got a clue. But what I like about this model, it at least attempts to set out the different states that we can get into and how they can overlap. And let's talk a bit more about that. So one way that I have found helpful is that in my way of working, when I've worked with people who have, like say in New Zealand, who have matakite, which is a kind of psychic capacity, but people can also present with severe distress, and it's well known within the community. Hearing voices, just like amongst Sangomas, just amongst the twazas, the apprentices of Sangomas, hearing a voice might be different things. So what I've tried to do in my clinical work as well is try to break down or create a continuum of voice hearing. And you'll see what I mean by this. The obvious one that we often come across, and I come across every day when working at Manawanui, which is the Māori Mental Health Service, are the painful attacking voices of psychosis. Very clearly distressing, incredibly painful, horrible, and difficult to live with. Then we have voices that are heard by about 3 to 15% of the population that are not distressing, that are just there, that might comment. Some call them angels, some call them just noises. And that has recently been accepted now, that not all auditory hallucinations are dysfunctional. Not all auditory hallucinations are symptomatic of psychosis. So there is a group of people who can and will hear voices, but not distressing and not really having a huge effect on their lives. But there is another capacity that I want to address with voices and voice hearing, namely the paranormal or the shamanic voices, where the voices actually become effective, where you begin to use the voices in your relationship with them to create changes in the real world. Now that is still very taboo. Not so much maybe amongst certain people in this audience, but clearly in the academic field, this is utterly unacceptable to make this claim, because how could a hallucination in any way be real? And this is something that I want to address today. So that's the continuum. So you have these two poles or three positions where we move, and people can move along this continuum in different ways. So when I start my kind of apprenticeship, I might have painful voices. They might be haunting me. They might be inappropriate. Then through training, they just annoy me at times. They might come at times that are not appropriate, but I can start mastering them and tell them to wait until I am incredibly effective with them one day, where I use them to access knowledge about healing or what a client has in front of me. So, or finding hidden objects, cattle, going hunting. I think many of the shamanic cave paintings were actually ways of finding the animals that we wanted to hunt and send off the hunters in certain directions. So there is a mastery involved in this, and that the shamanic spiritual crisis or the spiritual emergency is a training of voices through the continuum, and that they are all trance states, but these trance states become mastered slowly. So that's one way that I think about this. So let's wonder about mastery of psychotic states, so-called. And speaking with Deborah Lamshire, who you may know is on the committee and is an expert experiencer in terms of her voices. We've had some discussions around this, and we've even had, if you wish, we've done some work on comparing the expert experiencer with shamanic voices, and just see how the same it is or different it is using the hero's journey. I think we'll be talking about that at Liverpool at the ISPS conference there. So the shaman becomes the master of trance states. So he shifts from being a victim to a master of spirits. Similarly, Deborah Lamshire in her work with her own altered states of consciousness has become an expert voice hearer. And in that way, Deborah states that her focus is on her mind, and the mind will protect itself through dissociation, i.e. if something overwhelms me, I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to push that away. And it is for the voice hearer to decide whether this mind state or trance state is helpful or not. She then goes on to explain that if a person is victimized by voices, it is a distorted form of communication. That's brilliant. That's exactly my experience, what my teacher would often say, is that you need to work with the voices to get a better relationship so that the information becomes clearer. So shifting into a more meaningful relationship with the voices means the person shifts from being a victim to a master of psychotic states. For me, it was an amazing parallel to the words of my teacher, speaking about how to engage with the voices. So in conclusion to this aspect, don't worry, it will continue. Other cultures may have technologies, practice, and disciplines that could provide theoretical and practical insights to altered states of consciousness. So psychosis is not a collection of symptoms, but rather could be understood dynamically as a process of consciousness, as psychoanalysis does do, I want to say. The approach may also provide an understanding how symptoms of both dissociative disorders and psychosis have some similar psychological processes. Coming back to psychodynamic understanding of consciousness, I do agree. I do also feel some processes of psychoanalysis also struggle with consciousness that's incredibly effective or masterful. I don't think there is much understanding. Some transpersonal, psychoanalytically orientated psychoanalysts do, but they're still relatively rare. So this. It looks as if I sometimes disappear. I'm not sure you got that all, but I just want to say that I think wondering a bit about psychosis and trance states as altered states of consciousness allows us to expand other models, such as the traumagenic neurodevelopmental model, or even the model of Kingdon and Turkington. I don't think it would subtract anything from there. It might add something, if anything. Now, so the clinical relevance here is the difference between the shaman and the person with psychosis is that the shaman knows who not to talk to. And that matters because an understanding of the shamanic spiritual crisis of hearing voices that are terrifying gets you into trouble in a certain discourse and place like Western psychiatry. Not all psychiatry, by the way. I want to be very clear about that. Here's my teacher dancing at my graduation somewhere close to the Kruger National Park. He is greeting the ancestors. He's now going through dance into a trance state. And so his induction technique at this point is an intense dancing that just shifts the mind and then allows the ancestors to come into the body and to speak. What I want to highlight with that is that the shamans are experts. They're experts in altered states of consciousness. And it's a similar thing to what you would find if you would do a study with university students and ask them to jump 2 meters. Now, your study will then find that most students, especially psychology students, would never be able to jump over a hurdle of 2 meters. But you go to the Olympics, and that is the case. So if that is true, it doesn't mean just because most people can't jump 2 meters, it's not possible that we can. Why am I bringing that up? I'm bringing that up because shamans are like Olympic athletes of consciousness. Just because most people haven't mastered their altered states doesn't mean it's not possible. And unfortunately, many psychologists, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts have no mastery of these skills. And therefore, such experiences simply do not exist. But we cannot say Olympic athletes don't exist, can we? So in a similar way, I'd like to talk a bit about that. So just having anomalous experience is one thing. Yes, we can have a moment of hearing something, but having expert experiences means a certain mastery and training has taken place. A training that is still not accepted. A training in consciousness. So, for example, telepathy, I bring this up because most people, most academics would reject telepathy as scientifically, existing scientifically. But it has been evidenced. Even the leading skeptical psychologists had to admit by standards of any other area of science, telepathy is proven. Now, does that mean academia accepts it? Of course not. We won't let science get in the way of understanding consciousness, because the struggle for them would be, it would terrify them because it would break down the paradigm that we are in at the moment, a very materialistic, unconscious paradigm in academia. And I understand that's the way it is. But what I wanted to show you a bit is that we also, of course, have people with who are very distressed, claiming they are telepathic. Now, are they? Well, you see, that's where I need to also equally be discerning that although it might have been evidenced, does it mean we are dealing with something that exists for everyone? I'll give you a lovely example. I asked my teacher, tell me, how would I know that hearing my voices doesn't mean that I'm just mad? And how will I check this out? He said, oh, that's very simple, in his very laconic way. He'd say, we test them. So what he's saying is that we hear the voices and we check whether what they are saying actually has very real effects. If they don't, then they're not interesting. Or you need to actually shape them up to give better results. Your job as a Sangoma is to shape up your voices to be effective. So if you want to have a telepathic experience, you need to test it. So shamans are incredibly clear about this. So I just wanted to bring this up. It's done and dusted, so let's get with the science, although I know it will take decades, if not much longer. Same thing with lucid dreaming. It is, for me, always very amusing that when I talk to shamans, they know exactly what lucid dreaming means. They have this experience because they're experts in consciousness. You talk to psychoanalysts and psychoanalysts who are experts in interpreting dreams, and I'm not denying that at all. Lucid dreaming, it's a foreign concept. Many do not know what this means. And you have I found one little footnote in Freud's major book on dreaming, where he mentions conscious dreaming, but he brushes it aside as just the ego having control in dreams. So lucid dreaming is the capacity to be aware while you're dreaming that you're dreaming. And that allows you then to have very specific experiences. It allows you to focus the dream, to move in the dream in a certain way, to change the dream other words, to start walking within another world in a very, very different way. Now, Stephen Laberge, you can read up on him, he started showing that it's possible to do so. No one believed him. They thought it was absolute nonsense. So what he did, while in a lucid dream, he actually was able, while in a REM state, able to use his eyelids and give a Morse code. And in that way could evidence that he was lucid in REM state, i.e. dreaming. So does that mean it's accepted academically? I doubt it. But we have scientific evidence, what is well known amongst shamans. So there's often this intense scientific resistance. Still today, parapsychology and psychoanalysis don't mix easily. There's a long and ambivalent history with shamanism. You probably know the story of Freud and Jung, and I don't have time to go into it, but I wanted to just show you is that when Jung heard the noise in the bookcase and predicted it would come again, Freud was freaked out. However, Freud asked Ferenczi, who was equally interested in telepathy and wanted to write a paper, to please not present it in 1919, because he was trying so hard to make psychoanalysis scientific. However, they both sneaked off into Berlin and actually met Frau Zeitler, who was a medium or a shaman, i.e. contacting ancestors, and she could read letters that were closed, and she could read the contents. And they came out of that meeting, and Freud, I believe, said to Ferenczi, it seems something is to this, but I don't want you to tell anyone I ever said that. And I can understand. It is hard in our world today to talk about this. Jewel Eisenbut was a psychoanalyst who nearly got kicked out of the New York Psychoanalytic Association or group for his interest in telepathy in his practice. So we don't need more science, but maybe more psychoanalysis of resistance and the taboo that we get around this. Tapu, by the way, is the Maori word for taboo. The word taboo comes from the Pacific. So, however, I want to also address that shamans are equally skeptical. So when I had to go through my training, when you have to step up to become a shaman, you are tested in front of the community by finding hidden objects. And what they do is they hide it in such a way that not even your teacher knows about it, double blind, because the teacher is affected by your failure. So teachers are quite invested on students being able to succeed, but no, they get hidden, and you then have to, in a way, find these things not through reason, not through judgment, but through a trance state. And this is how they know, because you cannot know it rationally. So, for example, they would hide my certain bead in a calabash at the door, on the left door of a hut, and I was dancing and trancing in front of a group, and I had to say what the object was, and then to run to the object directly. Amongst the various huts, I had to find the right place. And I couldn't run around and maybe throw up various objects to check where the beads were. I had to find it immediately. If I hadn't, I would have seen as as having failed. So there's quite a strong quality control in certain traditions, not all, but in certain traditions, in mine at least, there was quite a strong quality control. So I just wanted to mention this because often there's an assumption that shamans maybe are less scientific. They equally have tests of validity and reliability. Now, let's come to this notion of the voices or telepathy. I want to raise something that I often come across, and you might have come across as well, is when spirituality and psychosis becomes mingled, it gets difficult because it's hard to distinguish this. And as you've seen, one way that shamans do is they test you. My teacher tested my voices. My teacher tested me during my training. My teacher, forced me to engage with my voices or my experiences with the information. I would get my downloads in a very specific way. One thing that needs to be addressed is discernment about spirituality and psychosis and distress is that there are two forms of errors, if you wish. The one is the reductionist error that says spirituality or psychic abilities don't exist. And what that does, it is often a very materialistic view. What it does, it shuts down many options that we've talked about. So it would not allow for mastery of voices, it would not allow for telepathy to exist, etc., etc. There's another form of error, the elevationist error, that you often also get, that everything is spiritual, everything is real. So if somebody says they have telepathic abilities, then it must be true. Well, this is not even true in many traditional societies. So it is worth remaining discerning and seeking a certain awareness in relation to reality. So I just wanted to point out, these are common errors that you will find in the literature. Some people feel that shamans are the most wonderful spiritual beings. It's simply not true. There's some wonderful shamans and there's some shoddy shamans. That everyone who has psychotic experiences is just having a wonderful spiritual awakening that is painful and stressful. This might be true in some situations, but it's definitely not true in all. Equally, the reductionist view is that all of this is just nonsense, everything's just auditory hallucinations, equally quite naive and limiting. Another common error is the pre-trance fallacy. So as to say, everything is due to my early development, i.e. very strong, often psychoanalytic views or neurodevelopmental views. Everything's due to abuse, to trauma. Everything has to do with my past. And that's the result of the distress and the psychosis. Or the trance state is everything has a spiritual influence. It's only spirits. It's only the spiritual energies affecting me or beings, excuse me, and therefore I'm affected this way. Both, again, are extremes that might need to be addressed. Ken Wilber is the author of these forms of discernments, which are really helpful to hold in mind. In fact, very helpful to hold in mind. So let's look at distressing spiritual states. I want to talk a bit about Kundalini, and I want to, and if we have time, I'm going to move through this a bit faster because I think we're going to be running out of time. I want to just hold a bit that for those that are aware of it, Kundalini is a term comes from India, from the Upanishads. It's an ancient term and means that there's a spiral of energy at the base of your spine. And it's at the Muladhara chakra and has often been kind of metaphorically explained as a serpent power, high energy power that courses through your body, comes up your spine and connects you to the spiritual levels above. Now, this is a kind of physio-spiritual process that moves up to the head. And you'll find this across all cultures, i.e., amongst Maori, it's called Māori. Amongst the San people, or what was called Bushmen, the Noom. So these are all forms of energy, even in Ruach and in Kabbalah. And a common warning that you will hear is that the seeker dares to awaken Kundalini power without grace and guidance of a guru might become insane, succumb to diseases, or even die. This because he does not possess the necessary knowledge, steadiness of mind, or patience required for this difficult undertaking. This is quite interesting. And why I bring in the Kundalini is because, again, in Western discourse, this energy does not exist. But amongst shamans or many cultures, this is an understandable and an important part of understanding psychosis. That a dysregulated energy system will dysregulate your consciousness, because consciousness is very closely related to this energy system and will have very powerful effects on you. And again, that entering into certain spiritual practices is not a wussy way of existing, but is actually quite dangerous. In the traditional model of Kundalini and energy, if you wish, and psychosis, you have the notion that the energy is liberated through your activity, through meditation, and there have been people who, through intense meditation, have released this energy within them, and it sweeps through them. And they say breaks through old patterns, brings up old pains, if you want to think psychoanalytically, brings up past traumas and past notions of errors, or if you want to think in terms of CBT, it triggers patterns of cognitive distortions, and in that way it breaks through, and often painfully so. It may stir up repressed feelings, as I've said, and a premature awakening may cause psychotic episodes in individuals, and I've seen that. Here are some of the causes. I'm not going to go into them. I just want you to scan them because I want to move on. Common symptoms are tremors, shaking, involuntary body movements. They have people with this have strong sensations of electricity, tingling, pressure, headache, especially the headache. Watch for that. Often stomach problems. Huge amount of anxiety, depression, depersonalization, intense mood swings, spontaneous slowing of thoughts and speeding up, trance-like things, inner visions. There's a richness of experiences, and of course deep peace that comes with it at times. I'm going to not go through this because you can see that when you get the PDF. But all I want to say here is I'm going to just, if you ever want to read more about a really difficult experience, read Gopi Krishna. His book or his experiences are illuminating, and we begin to respect how painful it is. I worked with somebody, I worked with a few people with this, and one person that I know who's got an intense Kundalini experience was important to understand that when she thought when she came to me I'd be only working with the Kundalini, but actually what I did was something a bit different. I was quite concerned that there were lots of traumatic issues that hadn't been resolved in her childhood, and when working through that, the Kundalini flowed much more easily, and she began to become more self-regulated. Her emotional regulation was more effective, and therefore the Kundalini also was able to move through herself much, much more effectively. But she was clearly diagnosed as psychotic and has had psychotic episodes when she was the Princess of Bavaria and etc. I want to just to bring up the notion that you have these, that's been called a Kundalini syndrome. I don't like the word syndrome so much, but that's what you'll find in the literature, some of it. It's an intense arousal. It is different from a single Kundalini experience. It might unfold over months and years, by the way. This is not a sudden experience, but it's incredibly destabling, and it is a process that is definitely a spiritual emergency that is quite unbearable for many and require a certain treatment, as I said. So what are the models? So there's the traditional model of healing energy and spiritual enlightenment. So shamans see this as a liberating part, very painful physically sometimes, excuse me, but in the Upanishads and in other traditions considered to be a pathway to enlightenment. You have the notion of psychological individuation. Bentov, if you ever want to read him, interesting way of looking at it as a physiological activation of the brain, and for some it's a transpersonal development, and of course a spiritual emergency. Now, what's the relationship with distress in this regard? So the controversy is this. Some maintain that mental illness only occurs during Kundalini awakening if there already are kind of predisposing vulnerabilities. And I've seen that as well, that some people might have vulnerabilities that the Kundalini just really brings to the fore, or in any spiritual emergency. Similarly with the Ukutwasa, in the apprenticeship, our vulnerabilities come to the fore. And I think that makes sense on a certain level. You wind up a system intensely and all the vulnerable parts become the place where we experience overwhelm and intensity. Others claim that the inappropriate treatment of Kundalini awakening is the frequent cause of psychosis. Possibly. So if somebody has intense Kundalini awakening, finds themselves in a psychiatric inpatient unit, well, yes, then that will be a terribly overwhelming experience. Others have suggested that psychosis can elicit Kundalini awakening or energy phenomena that mimic such awakening. Totally true. I think I've seen some people with so-called manic states that looked quite like a energy phenomena, but it wasn't enough for me to go, yeah, I think we've got something here. So it is possible, but I find that far more rare actually, and you'll see why. Bentov again claims that as many as 25 to 30% of people with so-called schizophrenia belong to this category. I must say, I don't know where he gets his data from, but I just wanted to bring it in as an example of people who have this belief. And Sanella, also well known in this area, makes a clear distinction between the two. And again, I'm not so sure. I think overlaps are quite possible. But I just wanted you to bring forward other viewpoints. What is the difference I see? People with Kundalini awakening often, although incredibly distressed, seem to be a bit more objective. It's one view. The claim is that they want to share this. There's not so much the paranoia involved. There's a sudden onset with no previous history, in some cases. I would check for current meditative practices, very important. So if you find somebody who's meditated for 4 hours and hasn't done that at all before, is that part of the meditative practice or is that part of a manic practice, i.e. a manic state that seeks meditation to then have very powerful experiences? It's worth having discernment in this area. Sensations of heat are really an incredibly common experience here, and that's what I find is a bit different. People have intense experiences of heat. I mean, they actually start sweating, or in their hands, have these sensations. They have this notion of vibration, fluttering and tingling all over their body. And that, again, is not so typical for my experience of people with psychotic distress. Bright lights is another one that I see. Pain, usually around the head, suddenly comes, suddenly disappears. Again, not so common. And unusual breathing patterns are worth listening to. Sudden movements in the hands, and automatic movements. That suddenly having noises like whistling and chirping. Not so much voices, feeling of energy move through you. And these symptoms do disappear after a while, although with the person I was working with, they haven't in that way. And at the end, it is claimed that the individual is usually at peace and knows how to handle that. And Gopi Krishna, if you read him, you'll find that. Here is an image of a Zan person healing a person through boom, the energy of Bushman, and the person behind him is supporting the healer. This is where I work, and just in the last, give me another 5 minutes, I'll just quickly whiz through this is where I work. This is the whare. This is a sacred place where where I'm supposed to be in about half an hour. And the place is a sacred place, which is a house where, if you wish, is used as a symbol of healing. The 4 sides of the house have the 4 aspects of health that are necessary to heal distress. You need physical health, you need psychological health, family health, and spiritual health. And this integration is what it takes to be part of a healthy human being. And this is the model we work under, and that's why I'm so grateful working at the Māori Mental Health Service, is that I can work with spiritual emergencies and bring it into the clinical review, and people know what I'm talking about. It's refreshing. It's wonderful. And it's so the Māori model is, if you wish, the Tohunga is the shaman. They again have strong sense of tapu, taboos. They were suppressed from 1907, but was repealed in 1964. Their treatment is to remove, demons from afflicted bodies, to balance male and female elements, to call upon their ancestors, and to strengthen your Māori. It's done through rituals, divination, ceremonies, charms, and medication again. Wrong. My experiences, and CP here stands for clinical parapsychological stories. Here are some of my experiences that I've had working with people at Māori Mental Health Service, out-of-body experiences, lucid, precognitive dreaming, telepathy, synchronicities, presences of ancestors in the room, and auspicious spaces. I won't be able to cover it all, but what I might do is to maybe come towards an end is to describe just very briefly working with one person who had the ability to, came to me who was described as quite psychotic, very dissociative. And she, after about 9 months, acknowledged that she could see people in the street who could walk through bus stations. And was she being mad? And we started exploring these experiences carefully, and it emerged that she has this ability. And we just said, well, just because you have an ability of seeing people who've passed on doesn't mean you need to freak out about it. So we looked at measures of emotionally regulating these experiences, using her distress tolerance skills, and just begin to sit with us and start not freaking out about it, but being with it, and also not letting it overwhelm her. She began to then settling a bit more, that she would use to able to even see the tupuna. I could see them as well in the session. She then one day came to me and said, I've heard the mopuk, there is an owl during the day on my roof, and I knew what that meant. In Maori tradition, it means that somebody will die. And the next session says, Ingo, you know what? My uncle has passed away. I can't make next session. I'm going to the funeral. And I said, absolutely. And we began to see whether she might have parts of her that have capacities through careful discernment that are not merely psychotic or paranoid. There were parts in her that were like that, but that there were others. And as she became more connected with the Maori tradition, she became more and more able to integrate this and start taking on a role of the fire, a wise woman in her community, to begin to see things and integrate them in a healthy way. So let me move on. These are other stories we won't have time for. Very briefly, I want to just add this, that the paranormal is actually quite normal. People with exceptional experiences are often marginalized in our society and are not, the positive experiences of exceptional experiences are often denied. And this is common. You know, we've had expert experience of psychosis have been denied. This women and mental illness have struggled with. Homosexuality was a disease. Madness in many cultures, or people who are different, have often been pushed aside. So the dialectic that I want to hold here and that I want to bring up is this. We need to begin to wonder about the dialectic as, on one part, there is the view that distress and spiritual experiences clearly overlap. They're one and the same thing. You know, so those are often the elevationist view, you could argue. The opposite view is there's a vast difference between psychosis and spiritual enlightenment. They are simply not the same. You cannot even bring them close. The one is filled with madness or negative spirits, the other is filled with highly skilled meditative process of consciousness, connecting with higher beings. How could we ever consider them to be similar? They're in fact opposite. I propose a synthesis that the overlap between distress and spirituality actually occurs developmentally, i.e., in the early development of a spiritual path or journey. Distress is often a very powerful point of calling, of engaging with this when our ordinary life falls apart because we are beginning to move beyond our ordinary social consciousness. Then we can experience intense and deep pain. And in that, certain distressful experiences to the point of psychosis is quite possible. But through proper training and through proper processes, a healing occurs that lets us move on out of the distress into hopefully either being healed and transformed, as all healing hopefully is, and if you wish, to then train the consciousness even more to move on to a spiritual path. So in that way, the dialectic of distress and spirituality is a way of thinking about how does distress and spirituality overlap, to do this with discernment. And there is maybe a way of thinking about it, if one does, as a journey, as a process, that these things are overlapping, but not in a simplistic way, nor are they utterly separated, nor do they totally overlap. Now, I won't go through the treatment options. They are often having to do with grounding. But one thing that I want to just add, these are things you will probably be able to understand very quickly. What I find important is normalization, validation of unusual, exceptional experiences. Self and affect regulation is an important part of the work I do. Integration and transformation. Spiritual holding, I won't have much time to talk about that, but I use Winnicott's notion of holding in dealing with spiritual matters or psychic matters on that regard. And I think something that we need to hold within the therapy as well, the social political factors and the cultural factors that influence exceptional experiences. So, for example, the person I talked to you about who had these amazing psychic experiences, when we saw ancestors in the room, how do I write those notes in the hospital records? That is a very important political act. Do I write them in such a way that I risk my own professional status? Do I write it in such a way that it's obscured? We both agreed to obscure it for her own sake, because I would have put her at risk if another psychiatrist would have also read this in a certain way. So, the difficulty about this dialectic is that a differential diagnosis is actually not possible in the materialistic world. There's no space to think, to be, to heal in other realities and discourses. And it always belongs to the edge. And it just has become much more unreal in the materialistic world. So what's the relevance of this? Why does it matter? Well, it challenges Western epistemology and ontology. It goes beyond the Cartesian mind-body split. And it goes beyond this Victorian empiricism that still holds psychology and psychiatry at bay. And the advantage of going there, it redefines who we are. So, I'd like to end with a little saying, a whakatoki, as Māori people say, ka pute ruha kahoe te rangitahi. It means, as an old net withers, another is remade. And so I hope that as we think about consciousness a bit differently, maybe listening to the ancient ones might bring us some new ideas about how to integrate
switch over to
spirituality and distress.
question and answer
Thank you
now.
very much.
There was Susan asked if there's any information or suggested resources around the claim that marijuana use is important to enhance spiritual awakening.
Ooh, interesting. Yes, my shamanic teacher mentioned that. I have to say, from many that I've heard who've made those claims, and I've met a few, I've not often seen the results of statements made. So I'll be honest with that. I have talked to some who've made those claims, and when I've kind of wished to test it a bit, I've not seen such results. So I'm not sure how much it would give that. It of course calms down, it regulates down the system. But some, I'm sure, can have that as experiences. I don't want to deny it, but I can only speak from my experiences, and I've not seen such strong results. I think there are other plants that do much more and are much more focused. But clearly in South Africa, Sangoma smoke a lot of marijuana, and they and my teacher said he used it to dream. So whether he added his expertise and training of states of consciousness to the marijuana to start becoming more lucid in it, I don't know. I never
yeah, people can always type in and ask for clarification if you don't get the
I hope that answers the question.
Answered. But Emma's asking, in the 4 areas treated in your clinic, does family represent family of origin, ancestors, and community, and social stressors, prejudice, poverty, etc.? So just if you can define family a little more.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, excellent question. Family is not just the Western small family of origin. It actually is the extended family, which means cousins, second degree, third degree, and also very close friends that literally become part of the family. And so when we say whānau or family, I think of it quite systemically of a community, the community around a person. And we work with anyone with a family or whānau who is considered to be that close. And people will often say, look, here is somebody who's my whānau, but they're not strictly blood relatives, if you wish, but are an important part of their lives. And for me, what I like about that model, that part of the systemic intervention, for me, holds very powerful social, cultural, and community factors.
Okay.
Poverty.
Sandra wonders, what do you mean by medicine in your teacher's tradition?
So those
is
are
it
things
pills
that matter.
or plants
Huge.
or
Great question.
what?
Ah, yes. Yeah. Medicines come in different shapes and forms, of course, strongly herbal. Medicines, they're called muti, are herbal combinations or ingredients are put together specifically for certain illnesses. So that can be parts of roots, parts of leaves, stems, flowers. However, also parts of animal parts. So when you, example, I remember him telling me that he would create muti for soccer players, and he would use the cartilage of a zebra because they run so fast. So there's also an aspect to medicine that's quite symbolic. So for nightmares, you burn vulture feathers next to a child so that the nightmares get taken away, because vultures are seen as holding dreams. So there is both a very pragmatic and very specific medical effect, but there's also a symbolic relationship. It's quite a big area, but it's a very important one. I hope that helps a bit. But yes, strongly herbal, strongly using, but also some minerals. Yep. I have to say, though, that this is often a very secret area of Sangoma's life. They were very open with me in my research, my PhD research about their trance states, but they would not have been that open about their medicines because they see that as the source of their income. So they will not reveal it. And some do have some very odd mixtures. Some of them are quite dangerous because they are beginning in South Africa to regulate this, these so-called medications, but yeah,
Hope
not
is wondering
everyone
if
is equally
EEGs
experienced,
have been done
some do
on
some
shamans
really
or
strange
people
things.
with these skills,
So it requires discernment again.
like electroencephalograph.
Thank you. Yeah. Look, yes, definitely, they have, and as usual, EEGs, I think ultimately, yes, they can show, strong alpha waves and beta. But the difficulty with it is, and that was actually, I wanted to do that research as well. But the problem actually I find with EEGs is we still don't know what it means if somebody has a specific alpha state or theta state. We don't know. What is it that is a theta state? So although we can see changes, we don't know what they mean. So that's why I was actually much more driven to understand what the experience is and what the meaning is of trance states. I also think the EEGs, in my view, are too crude a tool as yet. We need something much more refined to highlight the differences of trance states. So, for example, Lutz, etc., have found high gamma as waves in certain meditative states as interesting. But what that means compared to other meditations in different waves, we don't know. And I'm not sure that only one or few waves are going to really help us define this. We need far better tools to analyze consciousness with. So that's, I know it's not an exact question, but some research has done. Not always that easy when someone is dancing.
Could we have a few more minutes
for example,
to
access that trance state?
do you have to
I'm not
run,
sure that's been accessed. You need to be still.
Okay.
So that's one of the difficulties of accessing.
Really wondered if you could
states.
speak more about the causes of psychosis or spiritual emergency, perhaps comparing Western psychiatric theories of causes versus shamanic understandings of cause of spiritual emergency. And she's especially interested in the absence of a protective ancestor.
Okay. In the Sangoma tradition, the psychosis, the Amafufunyana, for example, is the result of, he always said to me, the few causes. One, the withdrawal of ancestors, i.e., if you're leading a life that's not attuned, not aligned, that can lead to ancestors removing themselves. What that does it opens you up to negative forces or spirits that then start haunting you. So the voices you hear, or start creating experiences of intense anxiety in you, which can create paranoia. The third thing he actually acknowledged to me was the use of substances, so drug-induced psychosis. He was clear about that methamphetamine or certain cannabis use can create psychosis. So he saw that as something different. And he also wondered whether brain damage can equally be another cause for psychosis. Excuse me. So that was his understanding, which in that tradition would be very true. Now, I also noticed that when he would be sitting with clients, he would also be interested in their life. So I often saw his therapeutic abilities of understanding where something came from. And in my way, that what I saw is that he was also helping them to down-regulate their emotions. So I wondered whether part of his work and working with the trauma of somebody was actually another very powerful healing effect. So for me, in my experience with psychosis, I am quite curious about trauma. I am quite curious about abuse, neglect, neurodevelopmental, early attachment experiences. I'm curious about intergenerational trauma and all. I see I've disappeared, sorry. And all these things, when I talked to my teacher about, he didn't have any struggles with this. He was quite open to that. And he again then would say, however, we need to give medicines to calm people down, help them. But two, we need to help the ancestors to calm them down so that the spirits don't attack you when you are going through a vulnerable time. So very stressful experiences are another cause for Sangomas around psychosis.
So Robin wonders, where
my understanding would be that
would
the
we
stress
find middle
or the
ground, and
crisis
how
creates
do
an
you find
opening
that and work with
for
it? So
negative
where we,
beings to enter.
yeah, that's it.
Okay, middle ground. I suppose for me the importance is what is important for the person. So how does this person find their middle ground or their way through this? So I follow the person and where they are going. If I find that they have a strong belief in something, I don't challenge that at all. It's not up to me to challenge that at all. But what can happen is through the therapeutic relationship, we can begin together to establish what works for the person and what doesn't from within their belief, wherever they are. So if somebody believes they are bewitched, I worked with somebody who was bewitched and he had a very strong view. But as we worked more with mentalization, he began to suddenly wonder whether some of his experiences of bewitchment might actually have been the way he mentalized it. Wow, okay. But that took us months, if not years, to get there. So the middle ground for me is holding that dialectic within me, not necessarily telling people about it or lecturing or anything like that, but it's rather holding it and then working with people to find their middle ground, their way of expressing their beliefs, their spiritual experiences. It's not up to me, in my view of this. So this is more for me as a clinician or as a practitioner to wonder about this. But if I have somebody from Africa in front of me, I don't need to, talk about a Western view of psychosis. But I wonder much more whether they are feeling better, whether they're feeling less distressed. How do I reduce the distress? Yeah. That for me is the core of the journey. And how can that
with many in
journey
Western
be
society
transformational?
today, playing with powerful
Whichever model
spiritual
that works
energies
for
and
them.
bringing about spiritual
If
crisis
that
and then being
could be seen
diagnosed
as
with
a middle
bipolar
ground,
or
maybe clinic.
schizophrenia. Do you have any knowledge of anyone whose diagnoses are reversed and then especially by psychologists, psychiatrists within the system, not by alternative practitioners? That's the question.
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but let me try. I think I think psychiatry and psychology can redefine anything as sudden remission. You know, everything is suddenly sudden remission. And I have seen people go to healers and come back very different. And again, it will be defined as sudden remission. So it's a difficult thing. In my work, don't necessarily, outside of Māori Mental Health Service, talk so much to other psychologists about anything. If there is a spiritual emergency about this, I see no need to. I'm much more interested in how do they
Karen
get
also
better.
asked, have you seen
But
art
I
and the
don't
arts
have
play a
any,
role in healing
like,
from extreme states
can't
of
think of
psychosis?
anybody in an inpatient setting who suddenly turns around and walks out normally or something like that. No. Yes, exceptionally. I quite am interested in aesthetics, and I've written an article about Sangoma Trance States, and say I think it's a beautiful and important part. Art is a way to also access altered states of consciousness, but the much softer form. So, for example, my teacher would make me do a lot of beading, and he said, in that beading, just notice where you go. And so he would allow, in the process of beading and using beads, to get into a quiet space. So yes, I think art's an expression of art. So for example, dancing was a very important, drumming, music are all inductive techniques into altered states of consciousness. So the aesthetics and the cultural aspect of this, which of course art would be part of, is totally
And Emma
integrated.
asked, do you work with family therapy related to Hellinger's
well
and his
as
constellation
the
work?
symbology of it.
He has
So
recently been acknowledging the soul.
Thanks. Oh, fantastic. Yes, I do work. I've been trained in family therapy, and there are times when I have worked with that, more in the past. And we do at times do family work, if that's what the question is. And what is so good about working at the Māori Mental Health Service is that wairua, or the spiritual aspect, the spirit, is absolutely part of our discourse and our discussions at times. So the family can also think a bit about how it's affecting the person and what they might need to do. And one of the things that we can do as a family is to support a person to down-regulate and to calm down, and to help them appreciate it.
Wonders if there's going to be full permission to share the slides and the video. The video, by the way, is going to have a public link on the ISPS website, so you can always just send people to that website. But what about the slides, if people want to send around the slides? Yeah. So they can share it. Okay, great. And let's see.
Ron, I've already, I think, sent you a PDF, so I'm very glad for that to be shared.
Yeah, people have made comments, but I'm not seeing more questions right now. So we are going to, allow, yeah, Ingo, did you want to let people have your email address if they come up with more questions at the end?
Yes, of course. You probably will find it on the PDF, but let me just give it to you.
Okay, it's on the
It's
PDF.
I
That's great.
N
I
for
mean,
Nelly,
it's been a great
G-O-R-A-B
talk and question answer
for
session. I
Bertha,
didn't absorb all of it because I was trying to keep
Ingo
things running, but
at gmail.com.
but I'll look forward to listening to the recording. But I really appreciate you spending your morning with us and sharing your perspectives on this.
No, thank you, Ron, for allowing me to share this. I try to do it much more from a shamanic perspective,